introduce this evening's critic to you, lecturer. Matthias Hollwich is a German architect based in New York City. He is the principal of HWKN, a practice that he co-founded with Mark Kushner in 2006. So, this project. In less than a decade, HWKN has produced an impressive portfolio of projects that range from concepts, installations, and interiors to buildings and urban design proposals. While his practice is visionary in its approach and aspiration, what sets HWKN apart from its other American peers is the impressive range of built projects, a feat for any young firm in New York or elsewhere. HWKN was the 2012 winner of the MoMA PS1 Young Architects program, resulting in the wildly successful and widely published installation Wendy. In 2013, the firm produced the Fire Island Pines Pavilion, followed by a number of large-scale developments. HWKN's clients include brands like Uniqlo, ManScience, Stephen Allen, and Il Laboratorio del Gelato. Currently in progress are a series of projects at various scales, some of which I hope we'll get to see this evening. Prior to founding HWKN, Matthias worked with Rem Koolhaas at OMA from 1996 to 2001, as well as with Peter Eisenman and Diller+Scofidio. He also teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. I have no idea when he finds the time. And he has also taught at the Powerhouse Foundation in Dessau and at the HA in Zurich. And finally, most of you have interfaced, unless you live under a rock, you've interfaced with another one of his projects, which is the online platform Architizer, which he co-founded in 2008. So please help me welcome Matthias Hollwich.
I must say it's a real honor that not everyone is watching already the Trump show, which is going to start today at 8 o'clock, I believe. So it's awesome to be here. And it's actually really amazing to live in today's times. I don't know if you guys are also so excited about it, because there are so many things that surrounding us that are really game changers. There's lots of disruptions. It's already a couple of years old, but the iPad has changed so many things in the way how we interact and work and socialize. I'm always envy about companies like Uber, really changing the game, how we can use transportation, and actually this very smart kind of technology, smart business sense, and strategic thinking, creating a business that from one year to the other one almost grows to $50 billion worth. Or Tesla, with coming up with a new brand and a new type of car and changing the world so that all of the different car brands are now trying to catch up. And sometimes as an architect, I wonder, how do we relate to such kind of amazing radical changes within our own industry? And I have to admit that I have not yet seen an architecture firm that is so disruptive in its own business. But the beauty is that we can be disruptive with every one of our projects. And there's a whole range of topics that we can tackle and that we can focus on and find innovation and new solutions. For example, sustainability. What we normally do is basically we have to admit that our buildings that we design are polluters. That's what they do. 40% of all energy consumption is consumed by our projects. And we're working really, really hard as a community to make a difference. And we see that negative impact, we try to reduce it with all of these amazing ideas of sustainability. In our firm, at some point when we got asked by the MoMA to come up with an idea for the MoMA PS1 Young Architects program, we looked into yet another way how we can engage with sustainability. How about having a positive impact to our context? how can we actually clean the environment and not pollute it. So what we did was we looked into the most sustainable structural system that can be used on a temporary basis. That is actually scaffolding. And its typical module is 7 feet by 7 feet. And we took as many of these modules as we were able to afford. MoMA PS1 doesn't give you that much money. So that's how far we got. And we added a textile. And we started to use the textile, we stretched it into its maximum capacity so that we had a huge amount of surface area that we could use for our purposes. And in the research, we found a magical material. It's called titanium nanoparticles. It is a nanoparticle that when the sun hits the particle, it acts as a catalyst and it actually cleans the air. It intersects an O2 and it turns it into O's, and that somehow magically connects with an NO2 and turns it into an NO3 that is heavier and non-pollutant. So basically what we were able to do with that magical material on that surface of our project, we were able to eliminate the pollution of 260 cars at any given time. And the beauty of it was that it was a fantastic performance in terms of ecology, but it was also just fun and beautiful and iconic. And we ended up calling it Wendy, which came out from a long night workshop on different names and ideas. My idea was actually to call it Urban Air Scrubber. And my business partner said, like, so not sexy. Let's call it Wendy. And Wendy became this beautiful phenomenon because people started to love it. Wendy had a Twitter account, Wendy had a website, and everyone loved Wendy and were coming to see Wendy and engage with it. And what we enjoyed about it was that actually from an ecological mission with extreme visible attributes, it suddenly started to educate people about new potential, but not as a teacher, as really just as a friend who told people a story. And inside you see there were like mechanical elements in it to actually advance the flow of air. We had this kind of big ass fans, how they're called, inside with amazing kind of water features. And people just enjoyed it, loved it, and danced around it during the warm-up series at MoMA PS1. And as longer we actually looked at the project, as more we realized that from that kind of idea of the ecology, it actually now started to be something very different. It had a personality that engaged with people and became a friend, and it was really that image that was published by Time Out New York that really captured our pride. Because we saw what the building or the installation did, it really transformed people's experiences at MoMA PS1. There's a little bit of a video. I think we can see just a little bit more about the atmosphere that it created. Because what we also liked is that Wendy was non-threatening. It was really modest, it was kind of almost dirty and unrefined, but that really broke down the barrier between the visitors who saw this kind of iconic piece of architecture, but immediately were able to relate to it. And you see even like the dripping of the water, the rough details that were just a result out of the structural system that we had to apply towards the scaffolding system. All of that really played a big part of it. And Wendy was so successful that actually it was the first installation for MoMA PS1 that traveled. We had to pack her into a box. That means we actually just took the fabric into a box, we shipped it to Abu Dhabi, and it was rebuilt out on the Corniche for the World Sustainability Forum. And it continued like a 2-week-long party outside on the beach, and it was absolutely fascinating how it also transformed a place like Abu Dhabi, which is nothing like Austin. You can just imagine. We not even found a bar, so it made a big difference. But that kind of sense of learning actually from a project, that there's an amazing power of architecture that can capture people's emotion, is something that it kind of starts to become a common thread in many more of our projects. One of them, it's actually a fantastic community out in Long Island, on Fire Island. This is the Pines. It has 650 homes, and it's legendary because it was the heaven for the gay culture in the 60s, at the time where two men were still not allowed to dance with each other. And all the creatives from Broadway, they came to Fire Island to celebrate their independence. And where they celebrated that independence was in a building that's called the Pavilion. A very modest / ugly shed. Then whenever you see somebody who has been to the Pines during that time and says like, how's the Pines? It's like, oh my God, the Pavilion. I had the best time in my life. At some point, it had to be renewed, and it was beautifully built, dumbed down and dirty by the next owner. And the Pavilion had lost its heart. People still went there, but there was no fire in people's eyes anymore. It really didn't connect the community anymore on such emotional level. And sometimes, we're lucky, a little fire took care of it. And thankfully, we got actually hired to come up with the next generation. And the next generation was actually a whole collaborative design process that we went through with the 3 owners who had just bought the building before a year. Before it burned down. But also they told us that there are going to be 650 homeowners, all of them believing that this is their building. So we started actually a process with everyone explaining some of the rules and requirements that they have to comply to. For example, we got a maximum box because that's all we were able to build because of the zoning requirements. FEMA actually changed a couple of things. They asked us to elevate the building above the boardwalk so that it was actually almost disconnected from the people's activities on the harbor. So what we decided with the community was that we actually chop off a corner of the building. We introduce many kind of floors and terraces that engage with the outside of the harbor. When you remember, the building before was all enclosed and was just a big box just standing there. So we wanted to reduce the size of the building's interior and make half of it outdoors. And then we're cladding it with an iconic facade that creates kind of an in-between of inside-outside and also the image-making interface. All of this, of course, sounds very easy, but it's so wonderfully complex. And that is the beauty of architecture. When we meet our clients, we dumb it down to the simplest principles, but then we work it out in all of the kind of complexities, where you see now this kind of angled core with this access and bathrooms and all the circulations that we brought in, segregating the backside, which is some of the offices and retail spaces, the front towards the terraces, and then the upper floor, the same principle. In the back you see already, this is actually the nightclub with in front the high tea deck, which is a bar. And it started to appear quite rapidly. We built it in 6 months out on the harbor. And intentionally, we actually didn't treat the wood. So that was actually taken just a few months in. And we wanted to have a rapid aging of the material so that immediately the building becomes part of the context of the pines, which has actually this beautiful weathered pine material that becomes silvery. And with that kind of open kind of lattice, it's almost as if the boardwalk kind of grows into the building. And what we also made sure, you remember we had to lift up the building because of FEMA, we actually engaged with the structure all the way down to the boardwalk. People can sit on it, and the building is actually friendly to the context and doesn't hover up above the people where they would walk just to the supermarket. And wherever we were able, we introduced other kind of stairs and access points that made the whole building porous and open and much more just part of the infrastructure of the island. And this is 4th of July, where you really see where the pride of the whole community is celebrated with actually a boat of drag queens arriving, which is the invasion. and everyone is just centering around the building to celebrate that appearance. And in the inside, we took a lot of inspiration from actually some of the legendary clubs in New York. And I'm still very, very glad that I spent all the entrance fees to go to all of them in the 80s and 90s, which now I could actually make a tax deduction from it because it's research for our project. But there were amazing clubs, like here, for example, the Roxy or the Saint is actually one of the most legendary one because it had this dome and this amazing light armature that animated that space. But we didn't have, of course, so much space available. So what we did was, through this kind of triangular dance area, we used the corners to create the bleachers, so that now we can create a visual relationship between all the people either way dancing and standing. We used the bar to kind of disconnect the back to the front to create a little bit more intimacy, organized a big skylight in the ceiling, and then we cladded everything with wood. So that it feels like, again, a total beachy, welcoming environment. And the bar almost like breaking through the wood kind of details opening up. And then we're hiding actually within all the different wood panels, the whole lighting system that's animated here. So with very, very simple kind of techniques and materials, we were able to activate again that big box from before into a super lively active space in the Pines. And it's now there for the second season, and it really became again the heart of the community and the place where people come together to celebrate the gay culture. And though it was a commercial project, we were actually fascinated that our client allowed us to go above and beyond that and actually not consider everything based on quantity and money. And that is something where we as architects, of course, are very often at challenging situations because we have to make things work. We have to look into efficiencies and all of these kind of things. But sometimes there are these wonderful clients, and one of them we actually have in Westfield, which is not a mall. It could be a mall, but it's actually a little suburb in Indiana. And the mayor decided that Westfield need a center, a core, a heart. And as the shopping center already suggested, every other suburb would build a mall and make that the center of the city. But he decided to actually have the city buy up a couple of houses, knock them down, and create a park. A radical, counterintuitive movement for a commercial driven proposition. Land Collective, the landscape architects, engaged with us to come up with ideas for pavilions within the park. And it's like super fun to have no boundaries and borders, to just fantasize what something like this could become. So we looked into bridging one of these little rivers, starting to kind of peel off maybe with the grass. This is one of my favorites where we just took like a little print out from the ground, set it up, had the roof just being kind of a resemblance of the dirt that we had to excavate to make the landscape live, playing with corner conditions. This is actually a bar where we were thinking about what we could do to really kind of spiral it down. But there was nothing really in these designs besides being like funny and silly and cute and maybe also iconic that made it particular to the site. And what in the end we came up with was actually after landing in Indiana or still doing the flight, we saw that actually everything is a grid. And how great is it to deal with a grid as an architect. So we took the grid, we let it fly over Indiana, then we take a piece of it, let it crash to the ground, and actually generate 4 different pavilions that are just sitting in the landscape. And these pavilions have 4 different programs. One of them becomes a band show for music performances. Another one becomes a cafe this is actually the bike storage and the activity center. Then a cafe that engages also with a skating rink in the winter, with flexibility of the facade. And all of that is basically glued together with the landscape that is designed by Land Collective, that engages with a river that has actually a lot of flooding issues that we have to take care of. And you see that what we started to do is we started to use the grid, and we created these objects that relate to each other, so that we have 4 different programs that we can take care of within one architectural principle. But then also by actually creating this kind of rough edge, we found out that the material, of course, Indiana limestone, is one of the fantastic materials that we can actually use, which come from local sources. And it's beautiful on the outside, and it's beautiful in the inside. And we have gone to many of the different quarries, and there's actually one of them, which is the Empire Quarry, which is still active. And the stone for the Empire State Building was harvested in that quarry. So what we basically created with our concept is that we engaged now with a arbitrary kind of architectural intervention really into the history and the materiality and the storytelling of the location in Westfield. And now we're actually in design development, and we're in problem solving and search for solutions. So here you see our first kind of model for the structural system, which is going to be steel. We first thought it could be concrete, but it's much too complicated. And finding now ways how we can actually fabricate a facade like this in an intelligent fashion. But the most important result of this exercise is that we generate iconic architecture that becomes the image maker for the city, that will attract people to come visit to create business. And that is the radical approach, to not create a business center or a shopping mall, to actually create something else that people become interested in, to come visit, and then the business is taking care of itself. Because there are developer plots around it, and the mayor decided to just let the market decide how they engage with basically his intervention, which is a fantastic community-driven park that it's in process to be designed. And that is something really powerful and beautiful for us in today's time. We are not just the architects anymore to design buildings that have to follow program and basically just provide solutions for physical needs. Buildings now have the possibility to become branding and communication tools, because a building is larger than any billboard in the world, and it's also there for a much, much longer time. At least hopefully. And there are many different ways how this can be done. And we actually designed 2 different hotels with very different ideas behind the kind of branding exercise where the architectural form becomes a communication tool. The first one is actually very close to the Domino's Sugar Factory. There's something so Austin about this, which almost sounds like awesome about it, which is this kind of gritty, grungy, cool kind of space that you want to explore and has something very mysterious about it. But something that is happening in New York right now, and I do love our friends from Shop Architects, which are spectacular architects, but it's being sanitized right now, and it's almost not recognizable as that kind of emotional, historic kind of relic that we all fall in love with. So from this kind of concept of kind of grungy and existing post-industrial kind of neighborhood where everything is getting sanitized and much more organized and cleaned up, there might be another way how we can engage with it, where we actually look into some of that kind of language that we can re-inspire ourselves and integrate into our design, but not in a way that it becomes kind of a Disney world for architecture, but something that comes out of a logic that is inherent also in the history of the site, but also has a logic that comes out of the programming. And the beauty of a hotel is that most of the money is being made on the roof when you have a bar. So here you see that we actually have a rooftop bar, which you see the centerpiece, the square piece with the garden elevated above. And then we have an elevator overrun with kind of view lounges on top of the building. And everything else is super efficient, very well structured hotel building that really complied to all kind of efficiencies that we had to bring in for our client for this building. And on top of the building, it also kind of captures this kind of post-industrial quality with a view towards New York. And we can bring that in, of course, also into all kind of interior spaces and play with it and have fun with it and explore how actually some of these kind of logics can trickle down into spaces that people feel instantly comfortable and welcome to engage with. And even here for these bedrooms, they're super, super, super small. What we did, we used just basically the subway tiles and called it a day. And I did hear that Corten is really hip in Austin, so yes, we did it. And another strategy is actually, funny-wise, also a hotel that we're doing right now in Williamsburg, but in another part of Williamsburg, a part which is actually all kind of almost flat, undistinct, kind of single-family or row houses. There's also a little highway that's running through, which is the BQE. And we went the opposite way, where we intentionally created a building that kind of sticks out and becomes its own entity within the context. We're designing it for the hotel brand Yotel, which is famous for its micro hotel suites. They have done the first project in Schiphol Airport and in the London Airport in Heathrow. And now they have one hotel in New York, and they're doing the second one now in Williamsburg. And you see already with the kind of branding and the pink and so on, or the lilac, they want to be different and they want to stick out, and they want to also explore all kinds of new fun things. This is actually the storage device for your luggage that they're using here the robot for. So this project is right now also in design development, and we engaged with all kind of limitations of New York because it's a very, very difficult site. We have to always maximize FAR with all the kind of efficiencies. So you see actually that we elevated the building and we have parking above, which doesn't cost us air rights, which you have to pay for in New York. We suppressed actually most of the retail into the underground to keep it hipper, but again, we don't pay FAR for it. And we're carving out these kind of different areas, and on the right side you see the BQE, how that engages with the retail kind of portion of the building. And then we're elevating actually a couple of residences all the way up into the sky, and everywhere in between you have all the hotel rooms in a almost kind of a micro size. And the shingles are inspired by all the kind of ugly vinyl sidings that are everywhere in Williamsburg, and we just supersized them, and we have potentially an opportunity to add photovoltaic to it, so it could also help us to generate some of the energy that the building is using. And this is a view which you're going to have from the residences back to New York as a building that really becomes kind of an icon and a branding for Yotel in an area that not naturally would be a place for them to be. So that is really kind of, again, the balance, how we can use our architectural form creation and the materiality to help our clients to establish something that's part of the business. And that is so interesting, right? Business. I don't know, how often is anyone talking here about business in the architectural school? Hands up. Who has heard something about business? Uh-oh. We had to learn it the hard way in our work. But yeah, business is actually fascinating if you can also disrupt it towards the purposes that are dear to your heart. And we as architects, we want to create successful buildings for our clients. And what we have actually started to do now is we actually start to engage with our clients very, very differently than what we used to do. So this is actually the University of Pennsylvania with a real estate department which is probably as conservative as yours here. And they invited us to an RFP, we won, and we started the design process, and we said, look, we're going to do it a little bit different. What we're going to do is we get everyone together into one room, and these are all the real estate people, and we're going to show you 10 different designs, and I'm not going to tell you anything about these designs, I give you a little green dot, and you just walk around and you put the dot to the building you like the most. So we saw the people just walking around, looking at them. We asked them for comments. They were allowed to write things on it. You see here, this is actually the architect who is very kind of intensely studying some of the very simple Rhino sketches without any kind of render efforts, just design, let them engage with it, and let them vote with it. And more we had like different kind of sequences with different kind of dots that were brought in. And there was this one amazing moment where you saw that people kind of found the one they liked the most. And there was Anne. Anne is the head of real estate. And she was the last one with her dot. And she walked with her dot like this, and she walked back and forth. And then I came closer and I wanted to really make sure that I know where she's putting her dot. And then she turned to me and said like, Matthias, you know, not every dot is the same. But the beauty what this generated was a discourse and a conversation with our client. And you see here these comments, what they added to. Optimize heat, cool load. All of these kind of things, it's not from us. Our client is actually designing with us on these kind of very simple sketches. Here you see that actually one of our clients designed a crown on top of it. These are the most conservative real estate people on the planet. They have to look into longevity and not into fashionable design. But they went for it and they had fun, and we had actually 3 different workshops with them. And you see here that there was actually one scheme, more and more dots kind of accumulated, and people were very interested in it. And it turned out that this is actually what they did choose, and this is what we're going to build, or we're actually already in construction for it. And it is a reinvention of the process, how you engage with a client, which is actually super fun. It's very satisfying for us as architects because we always get very kind of enthusiastic and direct information from our client. But it also lets us be different with our designs without risking that we immediately could lose a commission. So for example, for this project, most of the building is actually existing. So this is an old fabrication lab for DuPont. And the only thing they had asked us was to make it work for labs and to also just renovate the facade. But in this process, what we were able to convince them was that we said it's actually fine to create good infrastructure for innovation for these entrepreneurs, but that is actually not enough. We ourselves have started 2 different firms, Architizer and Hollwich Kushner, and we have learned that it's not enough to have a good idea. You have to constantly communicate about your idea, you have to excite people about it, you have to raise money, you have to find collaborators. So that's why we added this facade to it, which we call the business interface. The business interface has a pitch bleacher, has a boardroom, and a visitor center, which is going to be a constant reminder for entrepreneurs to present their ideas and to shape the way how they can communicate what they come up with. And when we made the calculation, is we know that this is $1.4 million more than a building that costs already $25 million. It's peanuts. But it really creates an emotional and aesthetic image and it's a facilitator for a new way how business is really conceived. And then, of course, we also designed the other side, much more modest, with a kind of triangular invitation from a public space that engages with the building. And we did make sure that you can actually see it from all kind of different directions, because that is also the first building that's going to be built on a new campus that the university is establishing, where actually all the other grass areas are plots of land that can actually be built for upcoming innovation centers. And in the inside, we had to make sure that we spent our money wisely, because we did spend most of it in the facade, so everything else had to be actually much more reduced. So you see here that we just used infrastructure that you have to pay for already anyway, which are the ducts and the lights, and we position it in the least comfortable center kind of, or least hidden center kind of access, put the lights around, and on the second floor actually do the same trick. We have a little bit more head height and put co-work areas within that kind of massive hallway. And then at the very, very front, we have that kind of pitch bleacher that will block the view out into the open, but it will become actually that kind of reflection of energy, of communication that goes back into the building itself. And so we structured everything, again, the beauty of a plan, into a super kind of rational organization with a central axis as an entrance from the north to the south, with the bleachers and all the kind of labs that are dry labs and wet labs, something that the university can curate over time. And then the upper floors where you see now where the business interface really kind of shapes up in a really interesting, different fashion. And it is almost, for me, a conversation between modernism, which is this kind of super rational building that was a lab, and something else, how we actually can add to the idea of modernism with a kind of critical, inspired, kind of new reshaping of architecture, where we use the power of the form to become part of actually the tools and the commission that we do. And one little test in this kind of world, and as you mentioned, Euro, that I was teaching at the Bauhaus, it is fascinating when you actually learn about the time in the 30s in Germany, which was definitely the biggest disruption in architecture that really happened. And a Bauhaus building from Gropius, which really was an excellence in exploring a curtain wall, new organizations, new materials and everything. But we also do know that actually it has done its damage in many levels because it was just copied with banality in many occasions. So the Bauhaus had asked actually for ideas for a Bauhaus Museum, where we just took the facade basically and created a little cube, and then we had fun with it. Very, very simple, just pushing up one little corner, standing it on its side, and becoming an invitation for the people to visit the collection and almost having a visible reference to the heritage of the mothership, the Bauhaus building, but now starting to play with it in a little bit of a different fashion. And that is something which is also beautiful, that at this point we do not have to have a very clear signature anymore in our architecture. Frank Gehry, Zaha, all of them, old school signature architecture. I believe today we can actually be much more individual in every one of the different buildings that we engage with, and we can explore the different potentials, and we can be liberated actually from a design philosophy that is limited and always find something that engages with a very particular task. If we said that there's a whole new kind of possibility how like a design like this has commonalities to designs to the Pines Pavilion, but that is coming really out of the process and coming out of the attitude and much less about a signature type of architecture. Because that helps us really to innovate on a constant level and not stop at something that we have done before. And it's also super fun, right, to always kind of reinvent yourself and find out how you can shape a building in a different way, even if it's a box, how you can engage with it, and sometimes just how could you make your life a little bit more complicated by lifting up the corner. Everything had to be rethought, and it really generated much more interesting spaces. Because that is what it's really about, creating environments that are worthwhile for people to experience and to enjoy. And one of the big topics here is actually living. I don't know who's doing actually a housing studio or anything with housing here at the university. Do you guys like it? Yes. Housing is tough, right? Because there's so many rules, regulations, so many logics that you have to do, especially when you go into codes, it becomes almost insane. But there is a huge opportunity now. And there's a whole paradigm change, again, how actually housing works and how developers do projects. And we participated in the Adapt New York, which was a micro-housing competition for the Bloomberg administration. Where we looked into the traditional house, you share your living room and your kitchen, everyone has their bedrooms here. New York apartments, normally studios or one bedrooms where everything is hybridized. So how could we do actually something different, which maybe is a little bit more like the tradition of housing, but within an apartment building complex. And when you go through just pure calculations, and I'm very jealous to the people who have 2,600 square foot in an average home in America. My apartment in New York is actually 450 square foot as an average studio. But for that competition, we squeezed it down even more, down to 250 square foot per apartment. But because we squeezed it so much, we could just give an extra 100 square foot to the community portion of the building. And it is like almost like what Mini Cooper with BMW has done. Basically, small is the new big, where you can actually reduce to the max, but you have to offer something else. And that is what we have in our toolbox, not just reducing, giving something back. And Mini Cooper did it with amazing design, beautiful, timeless, something that also takes every trick in how to maximize the available space. But they also created a whole experience around the car when you go shopping, that is already an extension of the car's experience. And they went beyond that. You have all of these activities, the club around the Mini Cooper, that keeps people engaged with the brand and these activities. So what we did was taking all of these ideas into account and turning around the typical developer model, where you actually have normally the amenities on the base. We turned it around to the top, and we created something that was this kind of micro-housing building with supercharged amenities at the location that normally is just reserved for the penthouses, for the most exclusive living environment. So to really give actually the exclusivity to the community, and with that actually create a social engine that becomes quite naturally because people want to be up on the roof. And it is about, again, also shaping, of course, a building into a recognizable form, but versus like the Chrysler building, which is all about a form and a light, we actually introduced all of these activities so that the top of the building, the iconic part of the building, is the collective with social dining, sport activities, and all kind of other ideas that can happen in such a space. And then the apartments had to be designed, of course, very, very intelligent from multiple usage, as a living room, as a workspace, and of course also as a bedroom itself. So this is our concept max that we did get finalists, but N Architects actually got the bid, they're building it, and we're very, very excited to see what the results are of the project. But we now have the opportunity to actually put all of this thinking into the test drive with yet another project. It's very, very small written here, I have to apologize, but it's totally confidential. So I cannot tell you too much about it. But WeWork is this amazing co-work brand that is, after 4 years of existence in New York, already the biggest landlord in New York City. They just got valued as a $10 billion firm because they really have done disruption in the office market. And now they're ready to disrupt the housing market. And we're working with them right now on all different prototypes, developing them for a rollout throughout America with sites in Miami, Seattle, LA, New York, and many other places. And we started just to focus onto the bed, expand the idea of what you need around sleeping and leisuring and hanging out, and designed an apartment around it. And from the apartment, we started to design the buildings in all of its functions and systems. And I hope that in 1 year or 2 years, I can tell you much more about it. This is a research project with implementation. We have 10 people in the office right now working on it already for a half year. And it's one of the most fascinating topics because housing, from all the other projects we're doing, it's so limited in terms of its availabilities of change. And here it's about rethinking basically everything. And the rethinking, and this is my last little chapter, is actually extremely important. We live going to be for the millennials, but there's a whole other group of people that needs a very, very urgent rethinking of the living environments. And I have actually been involved now into the research on aging with the University of Pennsylvania for more than 6 years. When I turned 38, I started to look into, 40s is coming very close to me, what's coming up, and I realized with 38 I was already halfway done with my life. As an average German, you basically die when you're 78. So I looked into what can I do in my second part in life, looked into what's all available. Retirement sounds great, but then at some point you will actually end up at places you don't want to be. And we worked actually with a developer on concepts for retirement communities. We invited different architects to work with us, and we worked with Lotec, with Nada Wuga, with Jürgen Meyer. But we realized that when we as architects put all of our energy together, it still will not be enough. So actually I started to write a book. I started to write a book which is called New Aging, Live Smarter Now, to Live Better Forever. And the fun part is that actually Penguin will publish it as a lifestyle advice. So here's my advice. So there's 76 million baby boomers that are right now at the time of aging. And that is a market and an opportunity and an urgency that you all should really take very serious, out of a social responsibility, but also out of a business opportunity. And there are 15,739 nursing homes in America, which sounds really great. But there are also 15,793 reasons to never ever go into any of them. And I don't know if you have ever visited one. Many people went there with their grandmothers or parents. It's horrible. So this is why I believe that we need actually a revolution. We need a revolution against ourselves. We have to reinvent the way how we as a society look into aging and how we engage with it in our own lives. And what the book is doing, which is actually basically a blueprint for everyone who's getting older, but we as architects can actually take many clues from there, and they're almost common sense that when we translate this into action, into architecture, that it could make a big difference. So I have a couple of points. Number one is, for example, love aging. Aging is a gift that we have to really enjoy, because the alternative is actually not so much fun. And when you're getting older, you come actually to a point in life when nobody else alive has ever been. So you're a pioneer. You're an amazing pioneer. You're not a senior, you're not an elderly, you're a pioneer figuring out what to do with the rest of your life. And as soon you define this, and as soon you realize, you actually will stop to discriminate against yourself. Because that is strangely the only discrimination that you will experience in your own future that transforms over time. And you have to become social, and this is where we as architects can really help. We have to make sure that actually people live close to each other so that they can actually craft a community around themselves, so that there is a network of support systems that normally come out of a family structure. And the ironic thing is that so many people who retire, they move to Florida, fantastic retirement environment, but then they move 3 more times in the last 3 years of their life. They have the first challenges, physical challenges, they move closer to family, then they move into an assisted living facility, then into a nursing home, and then they die. And when you actually consider that it is actually better to already live closer to your family, you can actually avoid many of these steps because you already built in a security system. And us as architects, we can actually provide some of the housing models that can answer that kind of challenge. Then we have to start to treat our friends like family. Something that is, the family structures are the most natural kind of support system again, and we can change that actually by inviting everyone into our lives much more intensely. So here's my recommendation for you already now, as your students, start to bring in people closer to you. That will be very helpful later when you're older. The same thing with colleagues, turn them into friends. Always have to make sure you meet your neighbors. And again, as an architect, this is your responsibility. Design the buildings that people run into each other all the time, that they say hi to each other. Start to design an elevator that engages people socially, and not that everyone looks at the screen, presses a button, and looks at the next weather forecast. There is something about the architectural tools that we can use that people can meet their neighbor. And then breaking down the fences. Why does everyone has to have a private pool? Let's share a pool. Let's create that kind of sense of community. And within the different houses, it's really also a beautiful paradigm change, because today most people actually buy the home for resale value. So they basically just buy the house so that they can sell it to the next person, so that they're deciding on a house for the next person. But that has to change. It needs to be a home for people that supports them at any given time. There's very easy access, possibilities to actually introduce amazing controls now, technology finally helping us to do so. And then architecturally, you know, these kind of grab bars are horrible, but they're useful. So how can you design every building you design with grab bars, so that it's a feature that is just common sense everywhere where people engage with it, and it doesn't become a retrofit that looks institutional in any other building. Creating a level field, of course, for the people just to have a smooth ride, because stairs can become a hazard over time. And then there are, of course, all the kind of little details that we have to deal with. These are just counter heights, all of the kind of things that you may know out of ADA requirements, but it's not an ADA requirement. It's really just something that you have to do so that everyone can use the space at any age. So that is the revolution that we have to do for ourselves. The beauty is that as soon as we do it for ourselves, it creates a collective and a community again. And that I realized that as an architect, we have that responsibility. We have to introduce everyone with it. But I hope that, for example, this book will create informed clients that will hire the architects, inform the architects what they need, because we have to actually start it from the ground up, because from the top down, it's probably not enough time. So beside all of these kind of things, you saw that there's a lot of curiosity in our firm, and we love to tackle things in one way or another. Starting with a book, I never knew that I'm going to write anything substantial. Starting Architizer and being playful with a social media company that really changed the way how architects communicate with each other and how clients look at architecture. And then buildings, which are the funnest things that we can do on all kind of different scales. Many of them I didn't mention. We're working on the one in the middle, for example, is a 1,800 apartment building complex in New Jersey. It's going to be a game changer for a depressed community with high density developments. Or really kind of fun cultural projects that we can really explore the potential of architecture in all kind of facets of spatial configurations. And then branding, even working with Mini Cooper, working with Range Rover, let's embrace them. They're part of our lives. We can work with them. They actually gave us really fun opportunities to explore things in a really rapid fashion. Housing, sometimes for private clients, a little bit painful, I have to admit. They have a lot of opinions. But if you make a cat happy, it's also a big success. And master planning. That really can take then the reinvention on the larger form. And all of this is really packaged for us in an office. We just grew to 40 people in our firm in New York. It's super fun because that is also something that is so important for us as architects to realize. I believe it's one of the hardest jobs on the planet, and we have to make sure that we have actually a fun time at any given time. So our working hours are being reduced from 7 till 6 by next year. This year we made happen that nobody works on weekends anymore. So it's actually about working really hard and very disciplined, but also give enough space that we can enjoy the rest of our lives. That is basically a little bit of an overview of what we do. And now I'm ready for some questions. Questions? Yes?
When you were designing the design process? How did you develop that process?
Yeah, we actually, that's actually a good question. I used to run workshops very, very early on, and also when I was teaching. Actually, my teaching method is very much a collaborative effort. It's very much inspired by IDEO, which has an amazing system set up how you create workshops and generate kind of collective ideas around products. And we use it now almost on every one of our projects. This one was just the funnest one because I would have never believed that the real estate team from the University of Pennsylvania would go for it. Cool. More questions? Yes.
You made the point that it's an exciting opportunity that that a work of architecture can itself be a billboard. But I wonder if maybe the short-term nature of the billboard is that way for a good reason, because what we advertise changes so rapidly. And so I wonder if you can speak a little bit about when you treat a piece of architecture like this kind of like single statement icon, what goes into that decision making of what you're trying to say, making that architecture a billboard? What is that billboard saying, I guess?
Yeah, absolutely. And I must say, I do agree. It's actually a very almost dangerous proposition because not everyone going to go deep into like a substantial understanding of what a building can do as a signifier with a longevity kind of process. And the three underlying principles in our firm is actually absorb local qualities. Because all the design, when you actually infuse something that is authentic from its context and informed from its context, it already becomes something that has a longevity in it. Then the introduction of social attributes, so that it's not just a good-looking building, it has to have a purpose that connects people and engages with people. And the last one is then shaping it into a recognizable form. So again, so that actually the tectonics of the building are engaged in turning it into a billboard and not any kind of just two-dimensionality that maybe Venturi would have introduced. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank God. Cool. More questions? Something harder. Come on.
Has teaching and giving lectures and stuff changed the way you design for your firm?
Absolutely. I think teaching is amazing. It's fantastically inspiring because you learn actually more from the students than they learn from you. So I think at some point, I think the revolt in the schools should be that students should get paid for being here. And yeah, we also hire always people out of the studio because we see the inspiration and we see how people think. And I think it's, yeah, for me, for the longest time, it was always absolutely essential to do the teaching and to put out challenges and ideas and thoughts that we had in our minds, but we can maybe not tackle them in the architectural praxis, but we can actually engage with that with a university. And that all the new aging work, all the research on aging was at the university with all the students, and it would have not gotten anywhere without it. So I think it's fantastic to actually do teach. Yeah?
Well, with clients and such, you were saying that a better way of like working together with the client, but at other times that you come up with a particular like, attribute of the building that the client disagrees with, and there are ways to kind of keep certain elements even if the client doesn't necessarily agree with them.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, of course it works the best if you have intelligent and informed clients, which are also maybe not on the emotional level, more on the rational level, so that you can actually have a very, because this design is not arbitrary at some point, the one that wins in such a process is the better solution. And when you engage with a client on that kind of objective, then you really can always argue it out. And as our mantra is that we never say no or we never say that you're wrong to a client because they do have a lot of knowledge and we just have to absorb it and rethink it and maybe present the same idea a little bit different and frame it into the way how the client maybe understands it, or we have to really take it into account. Yeah, thankfully we never got shot down, or never any one of our favorite designs got shot down. It was always empowered by the client. The only time where it can happen is private houses and apartments, and we have cooled down that business drastically because it's really tough to deal with when a client just says like, no, I feel it, it's different, and you lose your argument on that level. Mm-hmm.
In your PS1 project, you were looking at using materials and highlighting that. Can you try to carry into the other work that you do, like in the kind of building?
Yeah, so I think our office is driven by curiosity, so we don't have really an agenda, but it's always absorbing anything that we could find that makes a difference. And I have to admit, for MoMA PS1, we looked into so many different ways, so how we could do sustainability, architecture and so on. We had 100 different versions, nothing worked. That was 101 idea, and we didn't have a purpose yet for it. And then thankfully we found this material that actually rescued our argument and made it something that really became relevant. But ever since, we actually do always look into especially sustainability as one of the components. The other one is social responsibility. I'm dying to start to write a book about social architecture, which I believe is really what we all should think about. But it got really tainted, of course, in the 60s, where social architecture wanted to teach people how they should be. And now social architecture is much more about empowering people what they can be. But I think that's the same also with sustainability. As a German, I always say LEED certification is actually not a choice, it's a law in Germany. And so you have to be already on that standard. And then let's find other ways how it becomes actually more exciting and also communicative. Because when if you make a sustainable building, that's a good thing already. But if you can actually excite people about being more sustainable in their own lives, you make an even bigger change and difference, and that's what we try to do.
Matthias, the work is beautiful. I love that it's driven by the social interaction that you talk about, and also there's a tremendous sense of freedom and also humor in a lot of ways. And what's interesting to me is that it seems like there's maybe, do you feel that there's been a generational shift in, you mentioned the 74.5 million baby boomers, which in my mind, there's a certain kind of architecture that I associate with them, and yet there's this new architecture that you're presenting, which implies a certain different type of user that might be enabling it in a way that wasn't enabled before. Do you feel that there's a generational shift, and what is the cause for that?
Yeah, actually, very interesting question. If there's a generational shift now that's from the client side, there's actually I have to promote it, a TED talk from my business partner Mark Kushner about the next 30 years in architecture. And his argument, which I agree very much with, is that the big shift comes through social media. That now architecture, we used to work as architects in a vacuum. We designed these buildings with our clients and they got built, and then people hated them. But we didn't realize, because we already designed more buildings and they're coming, right? And it takes 5 to 10 years till a building is in place, and people didn't respond, and we didn't have that feedback loop that now we have. Social media allows us that we put out rendering, and you get instant comments, and you can adjust actually the way how you think about your design praxis and customize it, or you customize it basically much more in tune with people. But on the other side is also you actually invite people to be part of the creation process. So when they see it already as a rendering, then they see it how the construction starts, and then when it's there, they already part of the process. So I think the biggest change is maybe not generations, but it's really social media and technology that changes the way how a society is ready for innovation and how the society can feedback on innovation. I hope that answered more or less the question. We worked at OMA together, by the way, so you're allowed to ask even stronger questions if you want. Cool, yeah.
Yeah, you said at the beginning that we can be disruptive with every one of our projects. I wonder if, I guess, the two-part question is, number one, do you feel that every project has the responsibility then to be disruptive? And number two, do you think that sort of leads to a landscape of all architecture trying to be disruptive, every piece of architecture trying to demand our attention in a different way and kind of taking away focus on the life that's lived in that architecture?
Mm-hmm. Good question, yeah. So I actually don't believe that every building should be disruptive, but every building should be intelligent in terms of how, or responsible what it does. There are 95% of the buildings that are being built, I believe, are not responsible in terms of sustainability and in terms of social attributes. But they don't need to be all the next generation of a building, that's for sure. As long they do the things right, I think they also should have their place. But I think it's a personal choice. I think for me was always, I'm always curious about the future, and I believe that the future in the end is what you shape yourself and in your context. And we love to explore that kind of disruption with our buildings. But you're also going to see a couple of the buildings that we have done. The innovation was that we were able to add an aluminum frame on a window and to make the facade appear thicker, and with that more valuable and more substantial. And that made a difference that is not mind-blowing in the context of the world, but it's great for the building and the neighborhood. So I think there are different scales how we can engage with it. Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
was curious about how you define disruption, because it seems often it's like formal by like doing a dramatic scale.
Mm-hmm.
But do you also consider as in terms of like subverting people's beliefs of the context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, I mean, the disruption is, for me, it's basically like a game changer, which introduces something new that makes a difference in the long term. And it can be an influence that can be to the people using a building, or it could be an industry that changes, maybe by being inspired by a building. We know that many people have started now to use titanium nanoparticles to coat buildings. And that came through Wendy. That was the first time that actually people experienced it, and we could prove actually that it cleaned the air. So that's kind of the thing. It's like it's all on different scales, but it always has something inherent that is looking into changing the way we have done things before. And then the question is, like an Uber is changing the world for all of us, right? Because now we finally can just call a car and drive. But there are other disruptions which are much more minor, but they're also relevant. Cool, more questions? Yeah?
In some of your residential and hotel projects, you've taken the amenities, which are usually public and at ground level, by the street, and you've taken them to the top of the building. And I agree that it's very iconic. It's its own signage, but do you worry that you're disrupting the street in a bad way? That you're devaluing that space? That there's no public interaction there?
Great point. Actually, all the things, every one of the buildings has also a lot of activities in the base, which I don't feature that much, but I think it's worth really mentioning. For example, at Max, which was a micro-unit building, so the amenities on the top were for the inhabitants only, but on the ground floor we actually had a community center that our client brought in, and also cafe and a couple of other amenities. So yeah, that is actually really, really important, that you don't segregate and you create this kind of ghettos of little kind of urban spaces, and you let actually the building engage with the context. Absolutely.
With such a strong social conscious, do you sometimes feel that the fun and iconic part of your architecture overpowers the social implications of that you're trying to get through to the public, and that they see it more as architecture as a fun thing than rather a responsibility?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it definitely has a danger that it could go there. I think the next level, what is very important, is actually materiality. So for example, that when the Pines Pavilion, with it's already graying and it looks not perfect anymore, and it really feels like as if it has been there forever, people use it that way, and then there's not that kind of threshold of, oh, this is a pristine object that I cannot engage with. Same thing also with Wendy. On the photos it always looks like this kind of stealth kind of looking object, but as soon as we were closer it was dripping and ugly and not really perfectly refined. And we were actually, the curator at MoMA, he asked us if we would have liked to fabricate our own scaffolding system to beautify it, and we were like, oh hell no. That's exactly the way it needs to look. It wants to be rough. Also the Williamsburg Hotel, with Corten, the details, the way how we designed it, it's much more on the rough part. And I had actually a fantastic conversation with a museum director, Tom Eccles. We're doing right now a museum renovation upstate New York. And he actually want to hire an artist who has a concept of having all the construction worker being totally drunk and building the extension so that it is actually finally not so perfect and pristine and it's like a little fucked up. Which is exactly that. I think there's maybe a strong form, but as soon it's actually more modest in the way how it presents itself in the details. Not that I promote sloppy details, but like the materiality and how it really it's thought through on all the different levels could make that compensation. And that is like, we bashing sometimes Zaha in our office, where we appreciate her for all of the things she has achieved, but her buildings have kind of taken off and they become their own beautiful objects, but they don't engage really emotional anymore with the context. And we saw the results, what happened in Japan, that she's now not building that stadium. But I think that is something that our generation now is trying to tackle, that our buildings don't take off at this kind of super objects. They want to be grounded, they want to be at its location. And there's also really the beauty of localism again, where before it was all about international kind of unified design, and now there's like a richness again, and an embracing of local diversity. And I think that's important to bring in.
Maybe just one last question, right?
The last one.
So you talked about how we need to look into disrupting the business of architecture and how Uber succeeded and so forth and so on. And the problem is that we've been doing the same practice for hundreds of years, possibly thousands. And so it's become such a part of the culture that you have an office or an apprenticeship and the client comes to you. How do you even approach turning that on its head or fixing it in some way so that you have a completely new experience of creating building?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so actually, at the very beginning, my disclaimer was that I have not seen an office yet that has a disruptive business model. And I'm very curious if somebody can create that. The best disruption would be the fee structure, because it's actually totally counter our ambitions. That that every architect who is ambitious to do better things and invest more time loses money, versus the one which are the corporate architecture firms who are machines, soulless architecture that just dump in wherever they need to, and they become rich. So I think there's something like we sometimes we're toying this idea of creating a different contracts with our clients where we become part owners potentially of the building, where we invest more time and we know that the building, when it becomes successful, we have a higher return. Or when we become development partners, even from the early concept levels, because that is also interestingly the most risky part. The client actually, the risk capital, it's a fee to the architects, at least for schematic design and design development. Later on they can borrow against the design for the banks, so they put the risk to the banks. But if you can find, it's almost like a venture capital system in a weird way, micro way. If that can be changed, that would be interesting. The one thing that developers are changing now is actually crowdsourced buildings. There's actually one, they just finished a skyscraper that was crowdsourced. And that would be something, if we could take charge and actually make that part of our business, that would be disruptive. But I think nobody has dared it yet.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.